In 1875, a deal was struck behind closed doors that altered the balance of the age. It did not look like a battle. No cannon fired. No banner was raised over a captured city. It was a financial transaction, swift, discreet, and devastating in its consequences. From that moment forward, trade routes shifted, governments moved with confidence, and conquest found one more source of fuel: capital. Europe was entering its hungriest age. Great powers were no longer content to compete at the edges of the globe. They wanted possession, permanence, control. In the decades that followed, vast stretches of Africa would be divided and claimed by distant capitals that spoke the language of civilization while pursuing extraction. Britain stood at the center of this world, in command of an imperial system whose brightest jewel was India. But even empires have vulnerabilities, and Britain faced a geographic problem that money could solve. For generations, statesmen, merchants, and engineers had imagined a shortcut between Europe and Asia, a passage that would spare ships the long voyage around Africa. That vision had been realized in Egypt, where a canal cut through the Isthmus of Suez and joined the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. It was not merely an engineering triumph, it was a strategic revelation. Whoever influenced that waterway would hold a hand at the throat of imperial trade. Britain understood the stakes immediately. The route to India could now be shortened by thousands of miles. Time could be saved. Costs could be reduced. Troops, mail, commodities, and administrators could move faster. But influence over the canal required ownership, and ownership required an enormous amount of money. That is where the Rothschilds entered the story. From London, N.M. Rothschild and Sons provided the British government with the funds needed to secure a major stake in the Suez Canal Company. It was the kind of intervention the family would perfect over generations. Not theatrical, not public, but decisive. Governments might speak the language of destiny or patriotism, but behind the curtain, power often moved only when a banker agreed to open a line of credit. The consequences rippled outward almost immediately. Within a few years, Britain tightened its grip over Egypt and made the Canal Corridor a pillar of imperial security. What appears to be a simple act of finance was something larger and darker, a demonstration of how dynasties of money could shape the fate of nations without ever ruling them openly. That is what makes the Rothschild story so compelling. It is not simply the story of a wealthy family. It is the story of a financial dynasty whose influence passed through palaces, ministries, stock exchanges, and war rooms. A family whose name became synonymous with discretion and power. To follow the rise of the Rothschilds is to step inside hidden architecture of the modern age, where empire, industry, ambition, and wealth were bound together, and where the cost of power was so often paid far from the rooms where the deals were made. Long before the Rothschild name became shorthand for vaults, ministries, sovereign debt, and quiet influence, it belonged to a far more precarious world, a Europe of expulsions, quarantines, walled quarters, and sudden accusations. By the time the family emerged as one of the great financial houses of the continent in the late 18th century, the foundations of that ascent had already been laid across generations, shaped not by comfort, but by exclusion. Their story did not begin in marble halls or panelled banking rooms. It began in the unstable margins of European life, where survival itself required adaptation, memory, and an unusual fluency in risk. Like many old dynasties, the Rothschilds become harder to trace the further back one looks. Their roots appear to reach into the 16th century, perhaps earlier, though the record is shadowed by the larger violence that defined Jewish life in medieval and early modern Europe. Entire communities had already been driven out of kingdoms such as England and France, centuries before the family rose to prominence. Then came the Black Death, and with it one of the darkest recurring patterns in European history. Catastrophe followed by blame, and blame directed downward toward those already set apart. As plague moved across the continent in the mid-14th century, fear curdled into fantasy. Rumors spread. Wells were said to be poisoned. Invisible enemies were imagined. In town after town, Jewish communities became convenient targets for a society desperate to explain mass death with something human, punishable, and close at hand. Out of that atmosphere came migration, dispersal, reinvention. Jewish families moved eastward into the German lands, into Poland, into places where tolerance was rarely generous, but could at least be negotiated. The Rothschilds may have been among those families, though certainty is elusive. Their surname offers less geographic clarity than symbolic resonance. Rather than announcing a province or noble estate, it points to an image, a red shield. Perhaps it referred to a house sign, an inn, a workshop, or a residence marked by that emblem on its frontage. In time, the symbol would harden into identity. Later, when the family had wealth enough to claim heraldry, the shield remained. What may have begun as a practical marker in a crowded urban street became, over generations, an emblem of continuity, one image surviving long before titles, before prominence, before Europe learned to speak the family's name with fascination, suspicion, or envy. By the late 17th century, the family was active in moneylending in Western Germany. That detail matters because it reveals the paradox at the center of so much Jewish economic life in Europe. Many professions were restricted, land ownership was limited, access to guilds was often blocked. Advancement through the usual social channels was either forbidden or precarious. Finance, credit, exchange, these were among the narrow corridors still open, and so families learned to operate within them with extraordinary discipline. Money moved where status did not. A loan could cross boundaries that bloodlines could not. In a world that denied full belonging, liquidity became its own form of leverage. This, too, came at a cost. Christian doctrine had for centuries treated usury with moral suspicion, and the business of lending at interest carried a stigma even when it was indispensable to the functioning of trade and government. Jewish lenders were tolerated when useful, resented when visible, and vilified whenever old anxieties needed a fresh vocabulary. Some of the ugliest anti-Semitic myths in European culture found easy fuel in this contradiction. Christian rulers, merchants, and aristocrats depended on credit, yet the people associated with providing it were cast as sinister for doing so. Wealth, where it existed, did not erase vulnerability. It could even intensify it, making success appear incriminating. The same society that closed certain doors then turned suspicion on those who survived by finding another entrance. By the 18th century, the Rothschilds were firmly present in Frankfurt, one of the most important commercial cities in the German-speaking world. Frankfurt mattered not only because of trade, but because it was a place where information, capital, and political ambition crossed paths. Fairs brought merchants together, courts needed funds, regional rulers operated in constant negotiation with creditors, suppliers, and power brokers. In such a place, a gifted financier could do more than lend money. He could become useful to the people who governed land, collected taxes, fielded armies, and dreamed of dynastic permanence. Still, the Rothschilds at this stage were not yet the Rothschilds of legend. They were not a continental force. They were not yet synonymous with government finance or international reach. They were a family positioned within a trade that required calculation, patience, and an almost architectural understanding of dependence. Who needed money, who could repay, who could not, who might one day become powerful enough that an early favor would return tenfold. The leap from local prominence to historic influence would require more than continuity. It would require a figure capable of turning inherited skill into system, of recognizing that the old business of lending could become something larger in a Europe being transformed by war, state expansion, and the early mechanics of modern capitalism. That figure was Meyer Amschel Rothschild. He did not step into a world designed to reward him. He entered one that had long treated families like his as necessary, but never entirely welcome. That tension would define much of what followed. The rise of the Rothschilds was not simply a story of money accumulating. It was a story of barriers studied closely enough to be used, of exclusion converted into expertise, of a family learning that when society denies you permanence, influence itself can become a form of shelter. Under Mayer Amschel, what had been a regional tradition in credit and exchange would begin to evolve into something far more formidable. A financial dynasty with the discipline of a merchant house, the instincts of political realists, and the memory of a people who understood how quickly favor could turn. That is what gives the early Rothschild story its particular tension. Beneath the later glitter, titles, townhouses, collections, country estates, and proximity to kings, there remains an older atmosphere, one of narrow streets, inherited caution, and opportunity shadowed by danger. Before the salons and ministries, there was fragility. Before the empire of finance, there was exclusion. And before the family became one of the defining names in the history of European capital, it was simply a Jewish household in Frankfurt, carrying a red shield through a continent that had taught it, generation after generation, to survive first and trust later. To understand how the Rothschilds rose, you first have to understand the room they were walking into. Their success did not emerge out of a vacuum, nor out of some private genius untouched by history. It arrived at a very specific moment, when Europe's old economic order was beginning to crack, and a new one, colder and more expansive, was taking shape beneath it. The modern financial world was not yet fully built, but its foundations were already there. Credit, speculation, distant trade, state borrowing, commercial risk, and above all, the growing conviction that money could be made to reproduce itself. That idea is older than any bank. Long before stock tickers, before gilt-edged government bonds, before the great counting houses of London or Paris, human beings were already recording obligation. Some of the earliest writing systems were not created for poetry or philosophy, but for accounting, for keeping track of grain, livestock, oil, wine, debt. Civilization, at its most practical level, has always depended on memory made permanent. Who owes, who pays, who stores, who profits. Commerce was never a side story in history. It was the machinery behind kingdoms, temples, armies, and cities. Over time, that machinery became more elegant. Coins gave trade portability. Contracts gave it structure. In the Mediterranean world, and later in the mercantile cities of medieval and Renaissance Italy, finance became increasingly abstract. Wealth no longer needed to move only in the form of metal or harvests. It could travel on paper, in the form of credit, promises, letters of exchange, and signatures authenticated across distance. A merchant in one city could transact with another hundreds of miles away using reputation, seal, and trust. That was one of the quiet revolutions of European history. Value becoming less physical, and therefore more mobile, more expandable, and more dangerous. By the 16th and 17th centuries, parts of northwestern Europe began pushing this logic much further. A commercial zone formed between cities such as Antwerp, Amsterdam, and London, and within it emerged an entirely new scale of ambition. Trade was no longer simply about moving goods from one market to another. It became about organizing risk, pooling capital, and turning overseas ventures into structured investments. Early exchanges appeared. Investors began to buy into expeditions they would never personally join. The joint stock company took shape. What had once been the gamble of an individual merchant could now be distributed across a class of backers. Profit was no longer only earned, it was engineered. Out of that world came institutions that now seem almost inevitable, though at the time they were revolutionary. Stock exchanges, chartered companies, national debt markets, corporate monopolies. The Dutch and English East India Companies did not merely transport spices and textiles. They represented a new form of power, part commercial enterprise, part geopolitical instrument. The boundaries between merchant, government, and empire began to dissolve. A company could wage war, sign treaties, build forts, borrow money, and enrich investors at home while redrawing the fate of distant territories abroad. Capitalism, in its early European form, was never innocent. It was inventive, yes, but also ravenous. It expanded not only through intelligence and discipline, but through force, exclusion, and imperial reach. And yet Europe did not instantly become a modern capitalist civilization. For much of the 17th century and well into the 18th, the dominant economic logic remained mercantilist. Wealth, according to that view, was finite. The world contained only so much trade, only so much bullion, only so much advantage. If one kingdom gained, another must lose. Economic life was imagined as a struggle over a fixed pie, and states behaved accordingly. They fought over sea lanes, monopolies, colonies, and customs revenues with extraordinary ferocity because they believed prosperity had to be seized from rivals, not grown through system-wide expansion. That belief shaped empires. It shaped navies. It shaped violence. European powers clashed across oceans, not simply out of pride, but because spices, sugar, tobacco, textiles, silver, and tea were seen as strategic reservoirs of wealth. If pepper or nutmeg could be controlled at the source, if shipping lanes could be secured, if a rival could be pushed out of a market, then the state itself would be richer. Entire theories of national greatness grew out of this mindset. Wealth was territorial. Trade was war by another means. Commerce and conquest sat at the same table. But by the middle of the 18th century, that worldview was beginning to erode. The change was not sudden, and it was certainly not clean. Old assumptions lingered. Empires kept fighting. Monopolies remained ruthless. Yet a different understanding of wealth was slowly entering educated European thought, and more importantly, practical European life. The question was no longer only how to capture a larger share of existing trade. It was how to enlarge the whole system, how to produce more, transport more, consume more, finance more. Economic growth began to seem not merely possible, but transformative. This was the intellectual climate into which modern capitalism properly stepped. Adam Smith gave it elegant language in the late 18th century, but the shift was already underway. Increasingly, merchants, governments, and financiers understood that prosperity could be expanded through production, infrastructure, industry, and exchange on a scale earlier generations had barely imagined. Markets could be deepened. Credit could be extended. New commodities could be cultivated. New consumers could be created. New territories could be folded into European systems of extraction and demand. Money, if organized correctly, could move faster than armies and reach farther than crowns. That last point matters, because once Europe began to think of wealth as expandable rather than fixed, capital became the decisive instrument of the age. The new world being born required immense amounts of it. States needed loans to wage wars, build roads, dig canals, service debt, and stabilize their currencies. Merchants needed financing for ships, inventories, warehouses, and insurance. Industrialists needed cash to build mills, buy machinery, and scale production. Landed elites needed bankers. Governments needed bankers. Even empires, for all their grandeur, increasingly ran on borrowed money. And that is where the Rothschilds appear, not at the beginning of commerce, not at the invention of banking, but at the moment when the entire European order was becoming dependent on finance at a new level of intensity. They were poised to thrive in a world where information had value, where political upheaval created opportunity, where sovereign debt could be traded, and where speed, trust, discretion, and scale mattered more than ever before. They did not invent capitalism. They arrived as it was maturing into something far more powerful than a local commercial system. They recognized, perhaps earlier than most, that the future would belong not merely to men who owned land or titles, but to those who could move money across borders, across wars, across dynasties, and make it work in several places at once. That was the age opening before them, not yet fully modern, but unmistakably becoming so. An age in which fortunes would be made not only in fields, mines, or colonial ports, but in ledgers, correspondence, bond issues, and private negotiations. An age in which the most consequential rooms in Europe were not always thrones or parliaments, but offices where risk was measured, loans were arranged, and governments quietly admitted what power has so often depended on. Someone, somewhere, had to finance the future. The Rothschild Empire did not begin with a palace, a title, or even a bank in the modern sense. It began with a boy born into a crowded house in Frankfurt, in a city already fluent in trade, hierarchy, and ambition. His name was Meyer Amschel Rothschild, and if later generations would surround that name with myth, the reality of his beginnings was narrower, harsher, and far more instructive. He was born on February 23rd, 1744, in Frankfurt, then one of the Holy Roman Empire's free imperial cities, a category that sounds ceremonial now, but at the time meant something concrete and valuable. Frankfurt was not simply another German town. It functioned with unusual autonomy, governed itself to a remarkable degree, and sat at a crossroads of commerce, information, and political theatre. In a fragmented German world of principalities, bishoprics, courts, and petty sovereignties, Frankfurt mattered. It was busy, literate, connected, and old enough to understand that trade was not just an economic activity. It was a form of power. The city had long been a marketplace in every sense of the word. Merchants arrived there not only to buy and sell goods, but to gather intelligence, form alliances, and measure the currents of the continent. Its fairs drew printers, traders, creditors, aristocratic agents, and men with correspondence tucked into their coats from half a dozen courts. Frankfurt was a place where money circulated alongside rumor, policy, and prestige. That mattered because Meyer did not rise in isolation. He came of age in an environment where wealth and political influence already touched shoulders in public and did their more serious work in private. His family, however, was not grand. His father was a capable businessman, respectable by the standards of his world, active in commodity dealing and credit, with connections that extended to local rulers and princely households. But this was not old money and sat in drawing rooms. The Rothschild household was large, compressed, and disciplined by necessity. Extended family members came and went. Resources were shared. Privacy was scarce. At times, more than 24 people occupied the same domestic space. Before the family became associated with continental finance, it knew something more intimate: congestion, pressure, and the daily mathematics of making limited means stretch across many lives. That kind of upbringing leaves marks. In later accounts of powerful dynasties, people often search for the grand inheritance, the secret patron, the glittering early advantage. But what shaped Meyer Amschel may have been something less glamorous and more durable: exposure from childhood to the mechanics of trade, the etiquette of dependence, and the understanding that security was never a given. In a crowded household tied to business, money was not an abstraction. It was structure. It was survival. It determined which doors opened, which humiliations could be postponed, which futures remained negotiable. At 13, he was sent away to Hanover. That decision alone tells you something about the family's seriousness. Boys were not sent out lightly. Apprenticeship meant discipline, usefulness, and the possibility of upward movement through service. Hanover, then an electorate with close ties to the British Crown, was itself a strategic place to learn finance. It sat inside a political web that reached far beyond its own borders, and the household into which Meyer entered was no provincial counting room. He was placed with Simon Wolf Oppenheimer, a Jewish financier of significance, a man connected to the government of Hanover and familiar with the delicate choreography between private capital and public authority. This was the real education, not merely arithmetic, but atmosphere, not simply accounts, but access. In Hanover, Meyer learned what serious finance looked like when it brushed up against state power. He saw that wealth was not only accumulated through shrewd dealing, it was magnified through proximity to rulers, through reliability, through making oneself indispensable to people whose expenses were large, whose ambitions were unstable, and whose solvency was often more theatrical than real. Princes needed armies, courts, marriages, ceremonies, buildings, patronage networks. All of it cost money. Behind the velvet and heraldry was an endless appetite for liquidity. He remained there for 6 years, long enough to absorb more than technique. He learned habits of caution, discretion, and precision, the traits that matter in worlds where one misread signal can mean ruin. When he returned to Frankfurt in 1763 and re-entered the family business, he was no longer simply a merchant's son. He had been trained inside a more sophisticated financial culture, one that understood how to serve power without being dazzled by it. Over the next 2 decades, he built patiently. This is one of the most important features of the Rothschild story. The ascent was not theatrical at first. It was incremental, exacting, and rooted in credibility. Meyer extended loans, cultivated relationships, and demonstrated a talent for dealing with German aristocratic families and regional rulers whose finances were often sprawling, opaque, and vulnerable to mismanagement. He was not yet commanding Europe. He was doing something more foundational. He was proving that he could be trusted with the messy private realities behind public splendor. That distinction matters. Great houses, princely courts, and ruling families projected magnificence, but their finances were often fragile compositions of debt, rents, obligations, and political hope. To serve them well required more than money. It required patience, memory, and the ability to understand the social theatre of rank while keeping one's eyes fixed on the ledger. Meyer seems to have had precisely that temperament. He understood that aristocrats did not only need lenders. They needed managers of embarrassment, organizers of delay, architects of solvency. They needed men who could keep the machinery of prestige running. His great opening came in 1785 when William IX of Hesse-Kassel succeeded to one of the wealthiest positions in the German lands and brought Meyer into his financial orbit. This was not a trivial appointment. Hesse-Kassel was no minor backwater, and William was no ordinary patron. He controlled enormous resources and sat inside the elite political structure of the Holy Roman Empire. To be entrusted with his finances was to step into a different class of importance. Meyer was no longer merely lending to powerful people. He was helping administer substantial pools of capital tied to one of the richest rulers in the region. The significance of that moment would only become fully visible later. At the time, it may have seemed like the culmination of years of disciplined advancement, a talented Frankfurt financier rising into princely confidence. But history was preparing something larger. Europe stood on the edge of upheaval. Thrones would tremble. Armies would consume fortunes. States would need credit on a scale earlier generations had barely imagined. And when that storm broke, Mayer Amschel Rothschild was in an extraordinary position. He was no longer operating at the margins of German finance. He had access to immense wealth, he understood how political networks functioned, and he had already learned the essential lesson of modern power. Those who appear to rule are not always the ones who control the money. That is where the real story begins. Not with grandeur, but with placement. Not with celebrity, but with leverage. A boy from a crowded Jewish household in Frankfurt had become custodian of princely capital, just as Europe was about to descend into crisis. And in the history of financial dynasties, there are few positions more dangerous or more promising than that. In 1789, the French monarchy finally collapsed under the weight of its own illusions. Years of fiscal decay, court extravagance, war debt, and political paralysis had brought Louis XVI to a point no Bourbon king had expected to face. He was forced to summon the Estates General, an institution so long dormant it seemed almost medieval. What began as an attempt to steady the kingdom, instead, opened the door to something far more dangerous. Authority slipped. Ceremony lost its power. The old order, once wrapped in etiquette and sacred distance, began to come apart in public. The revolution did not harden all at once. It moved by stages. First reform, then rupture, then vengeance. Monarchy gave way to radicalism. Radicalism gave way to blood. The French crown was not merely weakened, but destroyed. Louis XVI was executed, then Marie Antoinette followed him, and with their deaths, Europe's ruling houses saw more than a dynastic tragedy. They saw a warning. If a king could be dragged from sanctity into spectacle, then no throne was entirely safe. Austria recoiled first, but it was hardly alone. Prussia, Britain, and other major powers soon joined the widening struggle against revolutionary France. What followed was not a single war, but more than 2 decades of upheaval, stretching from 1792 to 1815. Years in which the map of Europe was redrawn again and again by armies, treaties, occupation, and debt. Courts fell, borders shifted, old loyalties became expensive liabilities, and everywhere, war demanded money. This was the environment in which Meyer Amschel Rothschild found his opening. He was already connected to the immense fortune of William IX of Hesse-Kassel, one of the wealthiest German rulers of the age. That mattered enormously. In times of peace, access to princely capital was useful. In times of continental war, it was transformative. As governments scrambled to fund campaigns, sustain armies, and survive political chaos, Meyer was in a position to deploy large sums at moments when liquidity was as decisive as artillery. Austrian and Prussian interests, among others, benefited from that access. Behind the marches and proclamations, finance was doing its quieter work. Then the crisis deepened. Out of the wreckage of revolution rose Napoleon Bonaparte, first as France's most formidable general, then as emperor, then as the architect of a new imperial order that would overrun much of the continent, including the German lands. Yet even conquest creates opportunity for those able to operate in its shadows. Napoleon sought to cripple Britain through economic siege, attempting to seal Europe against British commerce through what became known as the Continental System. In practice, the blockade created scarcity, distortion, and a thriving world of smuggling. Meyer understood something essential about power. Prohibition rarely ends trade. It merely makes trade more lucrative for those with nerve, access, and discretion. Using his network, capital, and connections, he moved within that grey economy, helping goods cross borders that official policy had tried to close. By the time the Napoleonic era ended, the Rothschild position had been fundamentally altered. Meyer had not simply survived Europe's catastrophe. He had turned chaos into leverage, war into access, and disruption into fortune. In the age of revolution, that was the beginning of dynasty. For much of Meyer Amschel Rothschild's lifetime, Frankfurt remained the family's center of gravity, the original chamber from which the larger design would unfold. It was there that the business first acquired real weight, and there that the family began to convert financial usefulness into social leverage. In a Europe where anti-Jewish prejudice remained persistent, adaptable, and never far from the surface, that mattered. Wealth could not erase exclusion, but it could alter the terms on which exclusion operated. By the early 19th century, the Rothschilds had become so consequential within Frankfurt's commercial life that the old barriers surrounding Jewish residents began, at least locally, to weaken. In 1811, the city lifted its legal restrictions on Jews, extending to them the civil rights long reserved for Christians. It would be naive to mistake that for full acceptance. But it was a significant shift, and one that revealed a central truth of the modern age. Prejudice often softened when power became expensive to ignore. Yet even as Frankfurt remained the family's base, the world around it was changing too quickly for any ambitious banking house to remain provincial. The Napoleonic era had turned Europe into a furnace of debt. Britain, though ultimately victorious, had paid a punishing price for survival and supremacy. Fleets had to be maintained across oceans. Campaigns had to be financed from the Iberian Peninsula to the Low Countries. Subsidies had to be sent to allies. Governments, for all their rhetoric of sovereignty and glory, were discovering once again that war was not sustained by courage alone. It was sustained by credit, by men willing to advance money against uncertain futures. That was where the Rothschilds began to separate themselves from other financiers. They were not simply lenders in a single city or court. They were becoming something rarer, a family network capable of moving capital, intelligence, and trust across borders at speed. This mattered most in the war's final and most consequential phase. In 1812, Napoleon made the decision that would ruin him. He marched into Russia with overwhelming force, expecting one more crushing display of imperial dominance. At first, the campaign seemed to justify his confidence. His armies advanced deeply, and Moscow fell before them. But the victory was hollow. The Russians refused to give him the decisive surrender he needed. They yielded space, withheld resolution, and allowed climate, distance, and exhaustion to become their allies. Then winter came. What followed was not a retreat so much as a disintegration. The Grand Army staggered westward in collapse, broken by cold, hunger, disease, and relentless attrition. At that exact moment, when Napoleon's aura of invincibility cracked and the possibility of a united European response suddenly became real, the Rothschilds moved with extraordinary precision. Mayors' sons were already in place or being placed across the continent, and as the anti-French coalition gathered strength, the family was able to help channel enormous sums into the governments determined to finish the war. Britain and its allies required money at once, and in vast quantities. The Rothschilds could provide it, or at the very least help arrange it, at a scale that made them invaluable. This was not charity, it was strategy. By financing governments at the moment of maximum need, the family purchased something more durable than profit: access, gratitude, and prestige. When the war ended in 1815, the Rothschilds were no longer merely successful Jewish financiers from Frankfurt. They had become indispensable participants in the financial architecture of post-Napoleonic Europe. They also understood something equally important. In an age before telegraphs and modern communications, information itself could be monetized. News of military developments, treaty negotiations, and political reversals did not travel evenly. Those with better couriers, better correspondence, and better judgment could act before rivals even knew what had happened. The Rothschilds exploited that advantage ruthlessly. They moved in bond markets with a sophistication that scandalized enemies and impressed governments. They bought and sold sovereign debt with timing that, by modern standards, would invite accusations of insider dealing. But this was the early 19th century, and finance was still being invented in real time. Speed was power. Knowledge was profit. The family excelled at both. Meyer Amschel himself did not live to see the full scale of what he had set in motion. He died in 1812, just as Napoleon's Russian catastrophe was unfolding, and just before the family's greatest continental expansion would bear fruit. That timing is important because it turns the Rothschild story from one of individual ascent into one of dynastic succession. Many family empires falter at precisely this point. A gifted founder builds carefully for decades, only for lesser heirs to dissipate the inheritance through vanity, complacency, or incompetence. The Rothschilds did something rarer. They institutionalized discipline. Meyer had not merely raised sons, he had prepared operators. As the war approached its final phase, the family reorganized itself with remarkable ambition. Frankfurt remained the ancestral core, but the business was no longer going to behave like a local German house. It would become European by design. The five brothers, later remembered through the family's own emblematic language as five arrows, divided the map among themselves. Amschel, the eldest, remained in Frankfurt to preserve the center. Salomon established himself in Vienna. Nathan worked from London, where the real pulse of global power was beginning to beat louder than anywhere else. Karl went south to Naples. James, the youngest, and in some ways the most dazzlingly effective, took Paris. It was a brilliant arrangement, not simply because it expanded their reach, but because it allowed the family to function as a private transnational system at a time when Europe itself remained politically fragmented. Governments distrusted one another, the Rothschilds communicated with one another. Borders slowed armies. They did not necessarily slow correspondence or credit. The brothers could gather information locally, act on it quickly, and coordinate across capitals in a way few rivals could match. In effect, they built a family-controlled financial network that paralleled the political map of Europe while remaining more agile than any single state. Their early gains after Waterloo were immense. The continent emerged from war damaged, indebted, and desperate for stabilization. Government bonds had been depressed by uncertainty. State paper that seemed risky in one season could become enormously valuable in the next if peace held and confidence returned. The Rothschilds understood this better than almost anyone. They acquired sovereign debt when it was cheap, held or traded it with strategic patience, and benefited as reconstruction, industrial revival, and renewed commerce lifted markets during the 1820s. The profits were extraordinary, but more than that, they confirmed the family's transformation. The Rothschilds were no longer reacting to history. They were learning how to position themselves just ahead of it. Not every branch would flourish equally. Naples would prove limited. Vienna had its own constraints. Frankfurt, though still symbolically essential, would not remain the future's true center. The decisive story would unfold elsewhere, above all in London and Paris. Those two cities were becoming the paired capitals of 19th century finance, politics, luxury, and industrial power. To succeed, there was to move from prominence into permanence. Nathan in London and James in Paris would do exactly that, turning a remarkable family business into something larger and more formidable, one of the defining financial dynasties of the modern world. Paris was where the Rothschild method revealed its cold brilliance. James de Rothschild, the youngest of Meyer Amschel's sons, barely more than a young man when he was dispatched there, arrived in the French capital not as a social ornament, but as an instrument. The choice was audacious. Only a few years earlier, Europe had been tearing itself apart in wars that set Britain and France against one another, while the Rothschild network, with characteristic pragmatism, found ways to profit from the instability surrounding both camps. That was the family's genius and its moral ambiguity. They understood earlier than most that states might speak the language of loyalty, but finance obeyed a different grammar, one built on access, speed, and the refusal to be sentimental. In Paris, James entered a city that had survived revolution, empire, defeat, restoration, and exhaustion. Napoleon was gone. The Bourbons were back. France, like an aristocratic mansion after a fire, still possessed its grandeur, but required careful reconstruction behind the walls. James moved skillfully within that atmosphere. He aligned himself with the restored monarchy and established the Paris House that would become one of the family's most powerful engines, not merely for France, but for the wider western half of Europe. The office functioned as far more than a bank. It was a listening post, a brokerage of influence, a salon of state finance disguised as commerce. Post-war France had drawn a hard conclusion from the Napoleonic catastrophe. Britain had not prevailed by accident. It had prevailed because it possessed industry, shipping, credit, and the infrastructure to sustain war over time. That realization changed French priorities. In the 1820s, the state and the commercial elite turned with greater urgency toward industrial development, especially in the manufacturing north. Mills, transport, metallurgy, and infrastructure required more than patriotic rhetoric. They required seed capital, large, patient, intelligently placed capital. James de Rothschild was perfectly positioned to provide it. His Paris house became one of the discrete engines behind French modernization, underwriting the kinds of ventures that do not always make headlines but do change the structure of a nation. He was equally quick to understand that political upheaval elsewhere could be turned into long-term financial advantage. When Belgium broke away from Dutch rule in 1830 and emerged as a new kingdom, it was not simply a nationalist drama, it was also a financing problem. New states are born with flags and ceremonies, but they survive on credit. James moved aggressively into that opening. By backing the new Belgian order and acquiring a powerful position in its bond market, the Paris branch embedded itself inside one of the most strategically promising economies on the continent. Belgium would soon become one of Europe's major industrial centers, and the Rothschilds were there early enough to help shape its financial bloodstream. Still, Paris, important as it was, would never eclipse London. If the French branch offered elegance, reach, and continental sophistication, the British branch offered something larger: proximity to the empire that was about to dominate the 19th century. Britain had already spent the 18th century assembling the machinery of global power. By the 19th, that machinery was accelerating. India had been absorbed into imperial control. Australia had entered the British orbit. Singapore emerged as a trading stronghold. Hong Kong followed. Southern Africa grew in importance. The empire widened not only by military force but by commercial design. Yet for all its pageantry, Britain's reach depended on something painfully unromantic: its ability to borrow. Nathan Rothschild understood that earlier and more clearly than almost anyone. He had positioned himself in London while the Napoleonic struggle was still underway, buying government debt, extending credit, and tying the family's fortunes to Britain's capacity to endure a war of immense duration and cost. It was a gamble of staggering scale. Had Britain failed, the damage to the family would have been severe. But Britain did not fail. It outlasted. And when victory finally came, the value of the financial instruments Nathan had accumulated rose accordingly. Then there was Waterloo, the episode that helped fix the family's reputation in legend. Nathan's communications network moved faster than the official channels of the state, allowing him to receive critical news with unusual speed. In a market where time itself could be monetized, that advantage was priceless. What he did with that information became the subject of gossip, accusation, admiration, and myth, some of it exaggerated, some of it deserved. What matters is not the folklore so much as what it revealed. The Rothschilds had built something the old aristocratic world barely understood: a private intelligence and finance system capable of outrunning governments. London made that system vast. Nathan expanded the branch into bullion, sovereign finance, and high-level state lending. Gold mattered enormously in an era still disciplined by specie and confidence, and the family's position in the precious metals trade gave them another lever over the architecture of credit. By the mid-1820s, Nathan was wealthy and connected enough to steady the British government during moments of financial strain. That is an extraordinary threshold for any private banker to cross. At that level, one no longer serves the state merely as creditor. One becomes part of the state's hidden scaffolding. The moral complexity of that role became especially visible in the 1830s. When Britain moved toward abolishing slavery across much of its empire, the decision came with one of the most revealing compromises in imperial history. The enslaved were not compensated, but the owners were. The state chose to pay slaveholders for the loss of what it still treated as property. Financing that settlement required enormous sums, and the Rothschilds were among those who helped make it possible. It was one of those moments that says everything about elite power in the 19th century. Reform, even when morally overdue, still had to pass through the ledger. Justice was negotiated in the language of indemnity. Nathan's death did not end the dominance of the London house. His successors inherited not only capital, but position. Across the following decades, the Rothschilds were woven ever more tightly into British national life. They participated in the railway age, helping finance the infrastructure that remade the landscape and compressed distance across the kingdom. They were involved in major state business at the highest level, including questions of bullion and minting. By mid-century, the British government was not simply borrowing from them, it was drawing on their expertise. And as the century advanced, the family's presence spread beyond banking into the softer symbols of establishment power: parliament, society, racing, country life, patronage. That is what made the London and Paris branches so formidable together. Paris gave the family entree into continental reconstruction, industrialization, and diplomacy. London gave them access to empire, bullion, sovereign debt, and the deepest capital market in the world. One branch operated amid salons, ministries, and post-revolutionary Europe, the other at the center of a maritime superpower whose appetite for money seemed as expansive as its map. Between them, the Rothschilds ceased to be merely a successful banking family. They became part of the operating system of the 19th century, present behind factories and cabinets, railways and colonies, reform bills and imperial ambitions. They did not rule in the formal sense. They did something subtler, and in some ways more enduring. They financed the world that ruled. Success on the scale the Rothschilds achieved rarely remains content with profit alone. Sooner or later, money begins to ask for costume, ceremony, and social form. It wants a crest, a title, an invitation through doors that had once been closed. And in 19th century Europe, where rank still mattered as much as liquidity, the family's financial triumph inevitably began to harden into something even more symbolically potent: nobility. That transformation came with a certain dark elegance. The Rothschilds had helped finance governments, stabilize states, underwrite reconstruction, and move capital through the wreckage of the Napoleonic age. They had also, depending on the moment and the branch, shown no excessive attachment to ideological purity when money and access were at stake. They belonged to that modern class of operators who understood that regimes rise and fall, but debt survives them both. So when Europe's old dynasties began rewarding the family with honors, there was something faintly ironic in the spectacle. The aristocratic order that had once defined itself through blood, land, and inherited prestige was now decorating a family whose real power came from ledgers, correspondence, and the disciplined management of other people's crises. In 1822, the Austrian emperor elevated all 5 sons of Meyer Amschel Rothschild into the hereditary nobility. The gesture was more than ceremonial gratitude. It was an acknowledgement that the family had become indispensable to the post-Napoleonic settlement. They had helped fund resistance to France, supported reconstruction after the wars, and embedded themselves in the practical business of restoring Europe after catastrophe. To confer noble status on them was to recognize, in effect, that the old order now depended on the very forces that were quietly remaking it. There was, however, a strange tension beneath the honor. The brothers were not Austrian grandees in the traditional sense. They did not come from ancient military houses or landed dynasties rooted in imperial soil. They were a Jewish banking family whose ascent had been made possible by precisely the forces that were eroding the old aristocratic monopoly on influence. The Holy Roman Empire itself, the vast, decaying framework within which so much of old Germany had functioned, had already been swept away during the Napoleonic convulsions. Yet here was the Habsburg court, one of Europe's most ceremonial institutions, draping the Rothschilds in titles as if trying to absorb the future by ennobling it. And the family characteristically accepted. Titles accumulated elsewhere as well. In France, state honours followed. In Britain, recognition came more slowly but with deeper symbolic weight. The Rothschilds did not merely want access to elite society, they wanted permanence within it. Over time, members of the family were drawn into the formal language of establishment life: baronetcies, peerages, seats in political institutions, the polished rituals of respectability. Their name began to shift subtly across languages and courts, acquiring aristocratic particles and local textures that signaled not only wealth, but absorption into Europe's ruling decorum. The transformation was almost architectural. A family that had once stood adjacent to power was now building itself into the facade. But titles do not remove contradiction. If anything, they sharpen it. Beneath the honours remained the older truth. This was still a family that had risen by moving money through instability, not by inheriting ancestral acres. They had entered aristocratic society not as relics of the medieval world, but as financiers of the modern one. The grandeur was real, so was the unease beneath it. That tension is especially visible in the Naples venture, one of the clearest examples of how even a dynasty as disciplined as the Rothschilds could misread the deeper currents of history. In the years after the Napoleonic Wars, when Europe appeared to be settling into a new balance, the family extended its network southward into the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. Karl Mayer Rothschild was sent to Naples in the early 1820s to establish the family's foothold there. On paper, the move made sense. Southern Italy was ruled by a Bourbon monarchy, its court still draped in the fading theatricality of old Europe, and the region offered the usual attractions to bankers: state borrowing needs, political fragility, and a ruling elite whose financial dependence could be turned into influence. But Naples was never simply a commercial outpost. It was political terrain. The kingdom was one of the largest states on the Italian peninsula, covering the entire south and Sicily, and it existed within a broader contest for influence among Europe's great powers. Austria, dominant in the north of Italy, and alert to any shift in the peninsula's balance, had every interest in seeing reliable financial and diplomatic channels operating in the south as well. The Rothschild presence in Naples therefore carried more than economic meaning. It functioned, in part, as an extension of Austrian influence, discreet, deniable, but legible to anyone paying attention. That arrangement gave the Naples branch a certain strategic value, but it also imposed limits. The Bourbon rulers understood very well that the Rothschilds were not merely neutral lenders arriving with bags of capital and no political implications. They knew that money is rarely innocent, especially when it arrives from a family so tightly woven into the power structures of Vienna and the broader conservative order. Yet they needed the financing anyway. Like so many regimes of the period, the Bourbon monarchy was trapped in the humiliating arithmetic of dependency, suspicious of the banker, but unable to rule without him. For a time, the arrangement held. Across the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s, the family attempted to leverage its capital into lasting regional influence. Naples offered opportunity, but it also offered warning. Southern Italy was not one of the rising industrial cores of Europe. It was increasingly marked by poverty, administrative weakness, and a social order that looked less like the future than like an exhausted inheritance. The Rothschilds could lend to the state, support its finances, and insert themselves into its affairs, but they could not easily transform the underlying structure of the kingdom. There are limits to what money can repair when the political foundation itself is unstable. And then history moved. The Italian peninsula, long fragmented into courts, duchies, kingdoms, and foreign spheres of influence, entered the violent acceleration of unification. The old map began to fail. Wars, uprisings, and nationalist momentum destabilized the order on which the Naples branch had depended. Austria's position in Italy weakened. Bourbon legitimacy frayed. Then came the campaigns that reshaped the South entirely. By 1860, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies had been conquered and folded into the broader project of Italian unification under the House of Savoy. With that, the Rothschild position in Naples became compromised almost beyond recovery. Their earlier alignment with Austrian interests, once useful, now made them look like agents of a discarded order. In a newly reconfigured Italy, they were burdened by the memory of old loyalties at exactly the wrong moment. Influence that had once seemed prudent now appeared politically tainted. The branch did not collapse in some melodramatic instant, but it lost the conditions that had made it meaningful. That failure is revealing because it shows that the Rothschilds were not omnipotent. They were brilliant readers of markets, states, and elite dependency, but even they could be overtaken by the force of nationalist realignment and geopolitical change. Titles could be acquired, bonds could be managed, courts could be persuaded. But when an entire political world disappeared, even a great banking dynasty could find itself holding assets tied to yesterday's map. And so the family's story in this period carries both ascent and warning. On one side, noble titles, honors, and aristocratic absorption, the spectacle of finance dressing itself in the language of old Europe. On the other, Naples, a reminder that influence is always conditional, that alliances age, and that even the most sophisticated dynasties build at times on foundations already beginning to crack. The setback in Naples was real, but it was not decisive. If anything, it revealed a larger truth about the Rothschilds. A single failed foothold mattered less and less because the family's reach had already become continental and then global. By the middle decades of the 19th century, they were no longer simply bankers to courts or governments. They had become something more elusive and more modern, a private financial network capable of shaping outcomes across borders, often without ceremony, sometimes without public credit, and almost always from behind the scenes. Brazil offers one of the clearest examples. The country had been bound to Portugal for centuries, first as a distant imperial possession, and later as something more strategically important after the discovery of mineral wealth transformed it from neglected territory into a major colonial prize. By the early 19th century, the old imperial arrangement had already been shaken by the upheavals of Europe. Napoleon's campaigns had driven the Portuguese royal court across the Atlantic, an extraordinary inversion in which the colony briefly became the refuge of the crown. That displacement changed the political imagination of Brazil. Once a territory has hosted a monarchy, once it has tasted the machinery of state from close range, it becomes harder to return quietly to the old subordinate role. Independence came in that atmosphere, not through the same prolonged carnage that scarred other parts of Latin America, but through a more negotiated and financially delicate separation. Yet even negotiated independence has a price. New nations may declare themselves in public, but recognition is often purchased in private. Brazil emerged politically sovereign while remaining financially vulnerable. The break with Portugal had to be stabilized, accounts had to be balanced, compensation had to be arranged, and war had to be avoided. That was precisely the kind of transitional crisis in which the Rothschilds excelled. Nathan Rothschild helped provide the credit that allowed Brazil to steady itself and compensate Portugal, smoothing the path toward international recognition while reducing the risk of a more destructive imperial rupture. The point is not merely that the family made a loan, it is that they were learning to monetize state formation itself. In the 19th century, sovereignty increasingly required underwriting. The Rothschilds understood that new governments, like old dynasties, could not survive on principle alone. They needed access to markets, liquidity, and the appearance of solvency. That understanding opened doors far beyond Brazil. As the century advanced, different branches of the family widened their interests into mining, insurance, publishing, transport, and other sectors that sat at the intersection of information, industry, and power. Their influence became less tied to any one regime and more tied to the systems through which regimes operated. But the Rothschilds' story cannot be reduced to opportunism alone. That is part of what makes it so enduring and so morally complicated. Their wealth was built in the hard light of state finance, empire, and industrial capitalism. Yet there were also moments when members of the family used that wealth in ways that cannot be explained purely by profit. At times, conviction entered the ledger. The Crimean War is one such moment. On the surface, it was a geopolitical struggle over the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean and the future of the weakening Ottoman Empire. Russia's long pressure on Ottoman territories had alarmed Britain and France, who feared that further Russian expansion would destabilize Europe and transform the Black Sea into a Russian sphere. Once war began, it became another expensive demonstration of 19th century reality. Moral language, strategic language, and diplomatic language all eventually converged on the same practical question: who would pay for it? The British government, like so many governments before and after it, turned to financiers. The Rothschilds participated, but in this case, the family's involvement carried an additional layer. Russia's treatment of its Jewish population had grown increasingly oppressive. Restrictions on settlement and movement had sharpened the boundaries of exclusion, and anti-Jewish policies had become part of the imperial order. For Lionel de Rothschild, support for the anti-Russian coalition was not merely a commercial act. It was also shaped by a larger moral hostility to a regime that embodied the kind of institutional prejudice the family understood all too well. The loans associated with the war did not produce a neat, triumphant financial windfall. In some respects, they resembled something closer to principled intervention, costly and imperfect. The war itself ended without the kind of clean resolution politicians like to stage in portraits, but it did check Russian ambitions. Sometimes the Rothschilds made money from history. Sometimes they tried, however selectively, to bend it. That same mixture of conscience and elite power appeared again during the famine years of the 1840s. Europe's new transport technologies were shrinking distance, which was often celebrated as progress. But modernity has a way of carrying catastrophe as efficiently as it carries wealth. A fungal blight crossed the Atlantic with terrifying speed and entered a continent whose poorest populations had become dangerously dependent on the potato. In Ireland, the result was devastation on a civilizational scale. Hunger spread, disease followed. Emigration became both escape and bereavement. 1 million lives or more were lost, and the social order of the island was permanently altered. The moral scandal of the famine has never fully faded, in part because it exposed the brutality that can hide beneath liberal economic orthodoxy. Food continued to move through Irish ports while Irish families starved. Markets functioned. The countryside collapsed. It was one of those moments when the polished language of governance breaks apart and reveals something colder underneath. Against that background, the Rothschilds became major backers of organized relief. They helped finance charitable efforts aimed at feeding the destitute during the worst years of the crisis. No private contribution could compensate for the scale of the disaster or absolve the failures of the British state. Still, the family's response mattered. They used a portion of extraordinary wealth to intervene where official policy had proved catastrophically insufficient. The same pattern appeared in Scotland, where blight deepened an already harsh social landscape shaped by displacement, eviction, and economic restructuring in the Highlands and Islands. Here again, Lionel de Rothschild supported relief and migration efforts, helping fund organizations that assisted impoverished Scots seeking passage to North America, Australia, or New Zealand. These were not romantic migrations. They were the consequence of a world in which traditional lives had been made untenable. To pay for a family's departure was not to save a homeland. It was to acknowledge, in financial form, that the old one had already been broken. This is the tension that gives the Rothschild story its depth. They were beneficiaries of the 19th century's hardest systems: empire, industrial expansion, state indebtedness, and the global circulation of capital. They also, at times, acted against the cruelties those same systems produced. That does not make them saints, nor does it reduce them to caricature. It places them where many great dynasties truly belong, inside contradiction. They financed governments, but sometimes stepped in where governments failed. They profited from a world built on hierarchy and extraction, yet they also remembered what exclusion felt like. Their philanthropy was real, but it was never separate from power. It moved through the same channels as everything else they did, discreetly, strategically, from within the upper floors of society. And that may be the most revealing detail of all. In the 19th century, even compassion among elites was often administered like finance, measured, structured, and inseparable from the systems that made such fortunes possible in the first place. Like every dynasty that survives long enough to become a legend, the Rothschilds eventually produce figures who seem to belong half to history and half to folklore. Great fortunes do that. They create not only power, but atmospheres. Private worlds insulated from ordinary correction, where obsession can flourish under the protection of money. Among the most unusual members of the family was Walter Rothschild of the London branch, a man who on paper looked entirely respectable and in practice seemed to live in a cabinet of curiosities large enough to swallow the late Victorian age whole. He was born in London in 1868 into a family already so deeply embedded in British establishment life that public service, banking, and politics were simply part of the air he breathed. He followed the expected path, at least outwardly. He had a place in the family's financial world. He entered Parliament. He moved within the formal structures of elite Britain with the ease of a man whose name opened doors before he reached them. He also maintained connections to government policy in the years when Britain's imperial role in the Middle East was being redrawn after the First World War, particularly around questions that would later become entangled with the future of a Jewish homeland. In all the official ways, he seemed to confirm the family's extraordinary assimilation into the machinery of modern power. And yet Walter is remembered less as a banker or parliamentarian than as something stranger, a collector, a zoologist, a curator of life and death on an imperial scale. He had studied natural science in his youth, but for him this was never merely an academic interest. It became a consuming private empire. While other men of his class built galleries, hunted office, or refurbished country houses, Walter amassed specimens: birds, mammals, insects, reptiles, skins, skeletons, curiosities from every imaginable corner of the natural world. His fortune gave him the privilege of turning fascination into institution. By the end of his life, the collection associated with his name had grown to extraordinary size, running into the millions. Species carried his name. Natural history itself seemed, for a time, to have passed through his private estate. There was something unmistakably imperial about it. Victorian Britain had a habit of converting the living world into inventory. To collect was to classify. To classify was to control. Under glass, in drawers, behind labels, the empire could persuade itself that it understood the territories it dominated. Walter's life, eccentric as it was, reflected that larger sensibility. He did not simply admire the exotic. He accumulated it, arranged it, and brought it home. At times, the spectacle tipped into the surreal. There are images of him perched on a giant tortoise, looking less like a financier than a man who had wandered out of an Edwardian dream after drinking too deeply from the museum cabinet. Even more famous was the day he had a carriage drawn by zebras and drove it toward Buckingham Palace, apparently determined to prove that the animal associated with African wildness could be pressed into civilized service like a horse. It was a perfect Rothschild image in its own way, wealth so absolute that even absurdity could be attempted with ceremony. The zebras, unsurprisingly, did not become the next great innovation in aristocratic transport. But the episode survives because it reveals something important. The Rothschilds were never only bankers. They were also patrons of spectacle, collectors of symbols, and participants in that old elite habit of treating the world as something to be acquired, studied, improved, and displayed. That same instinct, to move beyond banking and into the deeper texture of society, can be seen in the family's expansion into wine. This was not a trivial sideline. Wine, especially in France, was never just agriculture. It was land, prestige, inheritance, branding, and old world legitimacy, bottled and sold. When members of the family began purchasing major vineyards and estates in the Bordeaux region in the mid-19th century, they were acquiring more than an industry. They were buying themselves into one of Europe's most refined symbolic orders. The timing, however, was almost perversely bad. Steam had shrunk oceans and accelerated commerce, but modernity has never moved only blessings. Along with new speed came new forms of contamination. The same age that transported goods and capital with unprecedented efficiency also helped carry agricultural disaster across borders. French vineyards were struck by phylloxera, a tiny pest with ruinous consequences, and one of the most prestigious agricultural cultures in Europe found itself quietly collapsing at the root. Vines yellowed, estates failed. Families who had believed themselves protected by tradition discovered that lineage is no defense against biology. And yet this was precisely the sort of catastrophe through which the Rothschilds could endure and even enlarge their position. Lesser proprietors were ruined. Old names sold under pressure. The family, backed by deeper reserves of capital, could wait, acquire, and adapt. They entered the wine trade at the edge of disaster and emerged holding some of its most storied properties. That says something essential about how dynastic money behaves. It does not merely enjoy prestige in its stable phases. It often consolidates prestige in moments of distress, when beauty has become vulnerable and heritage can be bought at the price of someone else's collapse. The eventual recovery of French viticulture, helped by grafting European vines onto resistant American rootstock, saved the industry. But when the dust settled, the Rothschilds were more firmly embedded in it than before. Vineyards that would later be treated as timeless symbols of taste had, in fact, passed through one more 19th century drama of money, disease, and survival. Their reach into state finance was even more consequential. In 19th century Europe, when governments needed rescue, there were moments when all the glitter of sovereignty fell away and the truth stood exposed. States, too, could panic. They could overextend. They could run short of cash. They could face humiliation in the bond markets just as surely as any private house. And in those moments, the Rothschilds became one of the first names to which power turned. Austria provides one of the clearest examples. The Habsburg state was one of the grand old political structures of Europe, draped in ceremony, military memory, and imperial dignity. But dignity is expensive, and after the upheavals of 1848, the strain on Vienna became severe. Hungary had nearly broken away. The empire responded with force, occupation, and continued expenditure. Added to this were military campaigns in Italy, and later, the shock of defeat by Prussia. The imperial structure remained imposing in public, but its finances were increasingly fragile in private. That was when the Rothschilds stepped in again and again, extending loans that helped keep the Austrian state functioning. This was not merely an instance of profitable lending. It became entangled with the empire's political reconfiguration. Vienna could not indefinitely sustain the cost of domination under its existing structure. Money was not the only factor in the eventual Austro-Hungarian settlement of 1867, but it was part of the pressure that made compromise unavoidable. When historians speak of constitutions, parliaments, and national settlements, there is sometimes a temptation to tell the story in purely political language. But behind those public events sits a quieter one. Governments rearrange themselves when their books can no longer support their illusions. The Rothschilds understood that with almost surgical clarity. They were no less important in France after the catastrophe of 1870 to 71. The Franco-Prussian War ended not merely in defeat, but in humiliation. Paris endured siege, deprivation, shock, and then the violent convulsions that followed. Great capitals, like great houses, can retain their facade while their foundations shake. Rebuilding Paris required more than masonry. It required confidence, liquidity, and belief that the city's future remained investable. The Rothschilds helped supply that confidence. Their capital supported the reconstruction of the French state and the infrastructure that would help restore France's economic coherence. Railways in particular mattered. Steel tracks were the nervous system of the modern nation, moving goods, people, coal, information, and military force. To finance railways was not simply to support transport, it was to participate in the remaking of space itself. By deepening their position in French rail and related industries, the family tied itself not only to French recovery, but to the reshaping of the country as a modern economic organism. And then there was Southern Africa, where the family's role becomes darker still. The late 19th century cloaked itself in talk of progress, expansion, and civilization, but beneath that language lay extraction on a brutal scale. Southern Africa had already been marked by conflict. British imperial ambition, Boer settler interests, African polities resisting encroachment, and all the violent rearrangements that occur when land, sovereignty, and racial hierarchy begin to harden under industrial empire. Then the mines transformed everything. Diamonds, and later gold, altered the economic imagination of the region. A territory once framed in strategic or settler terms was suddenly revalued through subterranean wealth. Cecil Rhodes became the public face of this new world. Restless, theatrical, imperial to the core. But faces are not the same thing as foundations. Behind Rhodes stood capital, and behind a great deal of that capital stood the Rothschilds. Through their investment in De Beers, the family helped finance one of the most consequential extractive enterprises of the late 19th century. De Beers was not merely a company. For a time, it was a mechanism through which diamonds were disciplined into monopoly, scarcity into marketing, and colonial territory into financial empire. It shaped labor, land, and political development in ways that extended far beyond the mine shaft. Gold and diamonds did not simply enrich shareholders, they reordered entire societies. That is the point worth lingering on. The Rothschilds were not always visible at the surface of history. Their genius, when they were at their most effective, was often to remain just far enough behind events that others appeared to be driving them. Rhodes thundered about imperial destiny. Statesmen spoke of order and development. Industrialists spoke of opportunity. Meanwhile, money moved quietly underneath, selecting winners, stabilizing ventures, and harvesting the rewards. By the end of the 19th century, the family had positioned itself not only in governments and banks, but in museums, vineyards, parliaments, rail systems, and mining monopolies. This was no longer a banking house in the narrow sense. It was a dynasty embedded in the physical and symbolic architecture of modern power. And Walter, with his zebras and specimens and strange private kingdom of preserved life, belongs in that picture more than he first appears to. He was not a comic footnote. He was a reminder that old money, once it becomes secure enough, begins to reveal its interior habits. It collects, it classifies, it acquires taste, it finances governments, it rescues empires, it buys vineyards at the edge of ruin, it backs mines that remake continents, and sometimes, in the middle of all that, it harnesses 4 zebras to a carriage and mistakes eccentricity for innocence. The Rothschilds were never permitted the luxury of being merely rich. Because they were Jewish, and because they became one of the most visible financial families in Europe, their wealth carried an added burden. It made them indispensable to the societies around them, and suspect within them, often at the same time. By the second half of the 19th century, anti-Semitism was returning in a harder, more modern form. It no longer relied only on medieval prejudice or religious hostility. It dressed itself in the language of race, science, nation, and conspiracy. Across Europe, new theories claimed that some peoples were naturally fitted to rule, while others were destined to remain outsiders. Jews were cast, with familiar malice, as both alien and omnipresent, excluded from the nation in theory, blamed for controlling it in secret. A family like the Rothschilds, wealthy, transnational, and impossible to ignore, became an almost perfect target for this fantasy. That atmosphere helps explain why members of the family increasingly directed money toward Jewish causes. This was not simply philanthropy in the abstract. It was, in part, a response to the realization that acceptance in Europe remained conditional, reversible, and never fully secure. As anti-Jewish hostility deepened, support grew in some circles for Jewish resettlement in the Levant, then still under Ottoman rule. Certain Rothschild family members became important patrons of that movement, helping fund agricultural colonies, land purchases, and institutional frameworks that would shape early Jewish settlement in Palestine. They were not pioneers in the romantic sense. Most would never live there themselves. But their money helped turn aspiration into infrastructure. And yet, even as they looked eastward toward a possible future, their position in Europe was growing more fragile. The family's great age had already passed its highest crest. The first generations had ridden war, state borrowing, and industrial expansion into extraordinary prominence. By the late 19th century, the world they had mastered was becoming less obedient. Market downturns struck. The French branch suffered during the prolonged economic weakness of the 1870s. New investments in oil faced punishing competition. Financial reversals, speculative pressures, and industrial change all made the old certainty harder to maintain. The deeper threat, however, was political. In France, the Dreyfus affair revealed how quickly modern nationalism could become a theatre of anti-Semitic obsession. In Central Europe, the old imperial order staggered toward collapse. After the First World War, the Rothschilds still had enough stature to extend credit to the wounded states emerging from the wreckage, but the landscape was less stable, less grateful, and increasingly violent in its resentments. Then came the Depression. In Austria, the crisis surrounding Credit Anstalt became one of the defining financial disasters of the interwar years. And because the bank was associated with the Rothschild orbit, its collapse fed directly into the fever swamp of conspiracy and blame. That was the tragedy of the family's European success. The more visible it became, the easier it was to turn into myth. By the time the Nazis rose to power, the Rothschild name had become one of the central symbols in anti-Semitic propaganda about finance, decadence, and hidden control. What followed was not merely insult, but dispossession. Assets were seized, banks were absorbed, properties, collections, and paintings were taken. In Vienna, Louis Nathaniel de Rothschild was arrested after the annexation of Austria and held under coercive confinement while the state stripped away what generations had built. For all their titles, salons, estates, and influence, the old truth returned in the end. Wealth could purchase access. It could build dynasties, rescue governments, and shape continents. But it could not always protect a Jewish family in Europe from Europe itself. After the war, the Rothschilds did what old dynasties rarely admit they are doing. They learned how to survive diminution. They rebuilt, but not as they had once ruled. The age that had made them indispensable, the long 19th century of European empires, sovereign debt, and private bankers whispering in ministerial corridors, was over. A different order had arrived, centered not in Vienna, Paris, or London, but across the Atlantic. American power now set the tempo of the Western world, and families whose greatness had been forged in continental Europe had to accept a quieter place in the hierarchy. there were other blows. In France, the family's position was shaken again when the socialist government nationalized one of its major banking interests in 1981, a reminder that even old money is never entirely beyond the reach of politics. But by then, the Rothschilds were no longer dependent on a single house, a single country, or even a single industry. Like many enduring dynasties, they had learned the art of dispersal. Finance remained central, but the family's wealth had long since spread into trusts, shareholdings, advisory firms, land, art, and businesses whose value lay as much in prestige as in cash flow. Wine became one of the clearest examples. What had once seemed like an aristocratic embellishment proved, in the post-war decades, to be a formidable asset. As fine wine moved from a regional European habit into a global luxury market, estates associated with the Rothschild name became not only cultural symbols, but extraordinarily valuable businesses. That evolution says something important about the family's genius. They had always understood that true wealth is rarely held in only one form. It moves from bonds to bullion, from railways to land, from state finance to heritage brands, without ever fully surrendering its character. And so the family endured, though in a less theatrical way. In the 1890s, to mention the Rothschilds in London or Paris was to invoke a near-mythic financial presence, one woven into empire, industry, politics, society, and the visual language of power itself. Today, the name no longer dominates public imagination in quite the same way. It does not circulate with the relentless visibility attached to modern billionaire culture. There is no single Rothschild who stands in the public mind as the uncontested titan of the age. That has led some to assume the dynasty faded into irrelevance. It did not. It simply became less visible and more diffuse. That is the crucial distinction. The family's fortune, spread across branches and generations, is difficult to measure neatly, which has made it fertile ground for speculation, exaggeration, and conspiracy. What can be said with confidence is simpler and more interesting. The Rothschilds remain wealthy, influential, and historically significant, but not omnipotent, and not in the cartoonish ways imagined by cruder myths. Their true legacy is more substantial than that. From the upheavals of the Napoleonic era to the age of imperial finance, industrial expansion, philanthropy, and modern statecraft, they helped shape the architecture of the world that followed. Their story is not only about money, it is about access, adaptation, exclusion, taste, power, and the strange durability of great families that survive by changing form. The Rothschilds are no longer the undisputed face of high finance, but in many ways the modern world still bears their fingerprints.